I'd like to welcome everybody back to Buford Pusser, The Other Story. This is episode 81. And today we've got something really exciting to talk about. Uh, we're asking the question, was there a cover-up to protect Buford after Pauline's death? Now, as you know, District Attorney General Mark Davidson should be getting close to making an announcement regarding the TBI's file that he's been reviewing over the past few weeks. Probably take a little bit longer. So in the meantime, we're going to be discussing what Mark might be looking at. At any rate, as you know, for the past 20 years or so, I've been looking into Pauline's homicide. And I've done that basically because Buford's story just doesn't seem plausible about how Pauline was killed. Now, I've gained a lot of information over those 20 years. I first found that she had never had an autopsy, found several witnesses that the TBI never interviewed back in 1967, had an individual report to me that they might actually have the gun that was used in the ambush. And I checked it out. It seemed to fit the story. Don't know if it was the one, but we called the TBI. They came out, picked up the gun. They have it in their possession right now. And it's one of those things where I don't think the TBI would have gotten involved in doing all this if they weren't earnest in getting down to the bottom of it. Now, let me say, while I'm on this point, that the TBI of today is not the TBI of 1967. Back then, I would assume that there was a lot of political influence that tried to disrupt their investigation. The agents of today are far better trained. They have technology that didn't exist back in 1967. They're just more qualified investigators all the way around, no doubt about it. Now, people often ask me, said, well, why did the TBI not find these things and you've been able to? Well, like I say, I think there was political interference back in those days that led to a cover-up. And that's what we're going to be discussing today, is who could have been involved in a cover-up, how deep it went, or how high it went, as the case may be. Now, let me say that you need to watch till the very end, because while we're going to review some of the things we found, talk about some of the people that were involved, at the end of this, we're going to make a little bit of an announcement and get into something that leads us into next Thursday's episode. And I think you're going to find that quite interesting. Now, today's guest is Dennis Hathcock. As you know, Dennis was the son of W.O. Hathcock. He was the one that discovered the second ambush site and alerted the TBI to it way back on August 12th, 1967. So, Dennis, welcome, and how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing great. Hey, we're here to talk about basically today, we want to get into the cover-up that I believe that occurred. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think there was a cover-up?
I'm quite sure of it. I would, if I was a betting man. If I was a betting man, I'd bet it was.
Um, I wouldn't want to bet against you on that. Uh, let's take a look real quick at the people that could have been involved in a cover-up. Now, I'm not saying all of these were willing participants, because I do think that a lot of them were subject to a lot of political pressure that might have gone on.
Right.
Let's take Warren Jones, for instance. He was a TBI investigator. And of course, the reason I don't think that he was actively involved in a cover up is because he had told too many people that they needed to get Buford off the streets. He knew what Buford was, uh, didn't like him that much, didn't trust him at all. And so I kind of doubt that Warren Jones would have been involved in a cover up. Your thoughts?
Well, from what I know about Warren Jones, and I know some people that worked with him and everything and knew him, he was probably as straight a guy as you'll ever meet. So, no, I don't believe that he was involved in any cover up. He might have been used, and it appeared that you probably thought he was, but I don't believe Warren Jones was.
Well, then that takes us to John Sloan, another investigator from the TBI. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I have mixed thoughts there. I know that he and Pusser were big buddies. And I also know that the TBI wasn't too happy with him, and they moved him out of the county after the Pusser incident.
Yeah. I know that he and a trooper went down to one of the places where Buford would often go to target practice, and they were digging up different rounds that had been fired into a berm and trying to find something that would match any of Buford's known guns. I'm sure that if Buford was involved in Pauline's murder, he probably wouldn't have used one of his known weapons. But just the fact that Sloan would go to that much trouble, I wouldn't think that in a lot of ways that he was really actively involved, but you never know. There's personal relationships do a lot to people.
Well, I've been told by people that had been in Sloan's house that he had a room in his house that was somewhat of a museum. I don't know how to explain it. He had all kinds of pictures of Pusser, all kinds of articles. He was into Buford. I'll put it that way.
Be sure and subscribe and hit that bell so that you'll get notifications of new videos when they're released.
Okay. Well, then let's take a look at Harry Peeler, the medical examiner there in McNairy County. Of course, I guess several of the people in the county that were like Peeler, Abernathy, just a number of them had to work together. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would actively cover for one another, but it doesn't mean that they didn't from time to time. What are your thoughts on Peeler?
Well, I'm probably a little I didn't think much of Peeler. I'll be honest with you. I loved his wife. Miss Peeler was a great person, and she used to would talk to me some about him, and they didn't have the best relationship in the world, and she didn't. He basically used her to get through medical school. I think she came from a family that was pretty well off, and she told me she paid for him to go through medical school. And then, like I said, they had some problems, and I went to school with their daughters, and with his daughter, Brenda and Lynn. But I didn't think much of him. I'll be honest.
Okay. Well, I guess my thought on it is that just from things that I've seen over the years, I think he tried to show some of the things as far as Pauline's wounds that may have been semi-accurate, but I can't say that they were totally accurate, that they reflected the story that as it should be told. Now let's move on to Will Terry Abernathy, the district attorney general at the time in 1967. You know that he had to work with Pusser pretty closely from time to time, but I have my reservations about whether or not he could have been involved in a cover-up. I tend to think that if he was involved, it was due to outside political pressure.
I would agree. I would agree. His son, Terry, and I are good friends, and I liked his dad. I mean, I was around him some but I was young, and I wasn't thinking about cover-ups and stuff. So it's hard for me to really say anything derogatory about Terry. But I also know that in those days, politics played a big part
Yeah, one thing
in
I
everything.
hope one thing that people understand is that back then you had the availability for politicians to get involved in what the TBI and everybody else was doing. And that's the reason, part of the reason, I guess, why in the early 1980s, the legislature changed the rules and said, hey, the TBI doesn't share information. And that's the reason that we have so little information about what the TBI knows even today. It would be so handy to know what was in their files, but they have the protocols. And I think a lot of that was probably designed to keep politicians out of the TBI's business.
Well, to be honest about it,
Yeah,
that
we're
was
going to
when
get
they
on to,
changed it. That's when they split it up
yep,
because of there was so much. Everything was political, so politically uh, motivated and everything. That's when they split it up. That's when they
okay.
split it up.
Jim Moffett, Buford's chief deputy. Now, everybody has some faults. I imagine Jim did as well. But I just don't see Jim as being involved in a cover-up to protect Buford, even though that they had to work so closely together. I think Jim was a lot more of a straight shooter than that.
Probably the straightest of the deputies. No question about it. Jim Moffat's a good man.
Well,
Like you say, everybody has their faults, but he was
no,
he was a pretty straight guy.
one thing that I go back to is that Jim once was asked who was the best sheriff he ever worked for. And after the Walking Tall movie came out, all this, you would have thought that he would have said Buford Pusser by far, by far. But
Yeah.
yet he said it was James Opal Gray. And that tells you a lot right there, is that he probably knew some things about Buford that weren't right. And that's the reason he didn't go with Buford being the best sheriff that he ever worked for. It's just one of those things where it seems like that uh, he had to keep some secrets, but I don't think that he tried to cover up for Buford.
Well, I mean, I know that you know what O'Neill told his son that he quit for a while. That he quit being deputy because of what you're talking about. He knew that Buford had twisted the facts about something, and he told his family that if anything happened to him, to look at Buford, look at Buford Pusser.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that you really have to think about. A lot of people ask me why that Jim probably stayed around as long as he did with Buford, and I don't think a lot of people understand how hard times were over there. That Jim had basically been a sharecropper at one time, had a huge family, including some adopted children, and
That is right.
that job meant a lot to him just in support of his family. So I think he probably did some things that he wasn't comfortable with, but he was doing them because he knew he had a big family to raise. He needed the job, needed the income. So he may have had to keep quiet and
Well,
such as that from time to time, but I don't think that he would have actively involved himself in a cover-up.
well, Mike, just think like you say, he had been a sharecropper. He was drawing a salary, a fairly good salary. They furnished him with a car to drive, paid for his gas. I mean, to him at that time in McNairy County, that was a pretty good job. And you know,
The one thing that amazes me about Jim is that when he said that all during this time, when Buford was getting cut up, shot up, run over
right,
by a car, all this and that Jim said he was never even in so much as a fight.
right,
And that's one of the things that's always kind of mystified me about the Pusser legend is that everything happened to Buford. You didn't see it happen to Jim. You didn't see it happen to Burks. You didn't happen to see it to Pety Plunk. Uh,
right.
it was all Buford. And I've never been convinced that if you had this state line syndicate that was so against law enforcement, that Buford was the only one that they would go after. So there is that.
Yeah, that is a pretty good question.
Well, that brings us around to T.W. Burks. I guess he was a constable at the time.
Right,
And, he would tell after the ambush that Pauline often went with Buford on calls because she was worried about his safety. Now, what gets me there is that in the first place, Buford and Pauline weren't getting along. She had even left him at one time, stayed in a motel in Savannah, and that was just prior to the alleged ambush. Uh, and to me, that doesn't sound like the kind of lady that's going to be worried about her husband when he goes out on calls. So the part that gets me is that Jim would turn around and basically say that's not true. If Buford had a call at night that he needed somebody to go with him, he would call me, pick me up, and we'd go together. But he said that Pauline never went out on calls with Buford.
well, what's the actual truth is if you could get a hold of any of the prisoners that stayed up there when Pauline was, cooking in the jail and everything, that she'd tell them. They'd say, Pusser would come by. They'd say, well, why don't you ride with him? And she'd tell them, there's no way I'm getting in the car with that crazy so and so. I'm scared to death to ride with him.
Well, now that brings us around to Pety Plunk. Now, if there is a person that I believe was actively involved in helping cover things up, that would have been Pety in my book.
Right. Right.
And I say that basically because, for instance, you look at what he did with Louise, your aunt, when Buford
Right.
shot her. He is on video saying that, uh, you know, Buford was forced to shoot her and that when he did, that there was a hole in her back big enough to stick a doorknob in that was created by, that 41 Magnum round going through her.
Right.
The thing that
Right.
people didn't know back then, they do know now, since that we got a hold of her autopsy report, is that the exit wound was to the
Right.
front of the body, not the back. And obviously, Petey just absolutely lied about that. And I guess I have the feeling that if he would lie about Louise, why wouldn't he lie about Pauline?
Right.
And
Well, he knew who paid his salary too. And I don't want to really talk about about Pety Plunk. You know, I know a lot of Plunks that are great people and all that.
Oh, sure.
But I knew I was around Petey some, and after, especially after he was a deputy, he worked for Paul Hively as a car salesman and everything, and I believe he's one of the biggest liars. I mean, he was one of them people that would climb a tree to tell a lie. And I don't mean. I know his daughter may hear this, and I don't mean. I know she loved her daddy. I know she cared about him. So does his son. But I'm just telling the truth, and I think you'll find most people that knew him will say the same thing. I mean, you couldn't believe nothing that he told.
Well, the other thing that gets me is the day of the ambush. He shows up out there at the first ambush site, climbs up on that hillside uh, above that creek, and starts telling the other investigators there's a sniper's nest over here. And
Right.
he's up there trampling through the weeds. You can tell that story better than I can, but the point is that he was on the passenger side of the car and no shots entered from the passenger side of the car. They were all from the driver's side. So obviously, he was either a very poor investigator or he was lying and trying to provide cover for Buford's story about the car pulling up alongside of him, the rifle coming out, and the shots being fired.
Well, I've told you and some other people that I never really give a lot of thought of it till the TBI opened this back up, and I would think about what went on that day down there. I sincerely believe that he was trying to cover up what had happened and misdirect everybody from the second site where I found the top of her head. I found the bullets. I found it. He was trying to keep them from going down there. I sincerely believe that.
Well, and but there's everything about the investigation, I guess, that we look at, the route that Buford took, how the ambush party knew that he would take that route, the time and motion. And by that, I mean, like when we tried to reconstruct Buford's story about the car chasing him down and turning on their headlights and the gun coming out and Pauline being shot at the first ambush site and wounded and going down to the second ambush site, and that's where she was killed and he was wounded. Uh, then there's the location of the shell casings that you found there at the second site, along with the scalp with the bloodied hair, all this. Buford's ever-changing story about whether he was going to a call at Hollis Jordan's or one on New Hope Road. Uh, there's I've always been really puzzled about why there was no autopsy on Pauline, and why that Buford would take Pauline on a risky disturbance call. To me, I guess the thing that gets me is why a rolling ambush of all things? If you want to put an assassination up to possible failure, do it with a rolling ambush. Why not just sit out in front of his house and late at night when he comes home, he gets out of his car, you pull out a rifle and you just snipe him. So the rolling ambush never made sense to me. But obviously, with all these things being ignored, I think there was a cover-up.
No question about that. I don't know, and it went all the way to the top.
Well,
it wasn't local. It wasn't just it had to go to the top.
Okay, and so we might as well quit tap dancing here and get down to the bottom of this. We're talking about Ray Blanton.
Yeah.
Pay me Ray.
If you want to learn the real story of Buford Pusser, you need to get my book, Buford Pusser, The Other Story. It is full of facts and information that you don't get anywhere else that I know of. It's the story as told by the people who live their own parts in the real tale. It's full of photographs, documents, lots of interesting things to see, and it pretty well outlines everything from Buford's birth up until the time of his death, and even after that, because the family became embroiled in a lot of lawsuits over his legacy. So, again, Buford Pusser, The Other Story. It's available at both Amazon.com and eBay.
Next week on Thursday, I'm going to have you back. We're going to talk about Ray and all of the things that he was into. And I think it's going to shock people about some of the things that he was into. And I think if people were to look up the name Samuel Pettyjohn, they'd be shocked about how long that Blanton was into things. I mean, he was selling state surplus cars. He was sold 650 commutations, getting prisoners off for pay. And
Right. Hey, and remember that they need to understand he sold 650 commutations.
that's right.
If you look at the other governors, one of them, the highest was 45.
Nowhere close.
And most of them was two or three is what they pardoned. So,
but I'll tell you what we're going to do next week. We're going to talk about Ray Blanton, his political history, and what they called impeachment Tennessee style.
Yeah.
And we'll get into some interesting things there that I think is really going to shock a lot of people that they don't know about Ray Blanton and how that he intended also to possibly make Buford his head of the Department of Public Safety. That would put him over the Highway Patrol,
over the TBI at that time.
And he'd have had access to all the criminal activity that was going on in the entire state, not just McNairy County. So
Right.
I think we need to get into that, really hit pretty heavy on that next week. So what are your thoughts?
I've really never talked a lot about Ray Blanton because, my granddaddy worked for the state and he liked Ray Blanton because Ray Blanton had helped him when he worked for the state highway department. I'd met Ray Blanton several times. He was one of them people you like. You couldn't hardly keep from liking him. But that don't mean
so
that he wasn't involved in a lot of things.
I'll tell you what, that's kind of like Bill Clinton. I knew Bill Clinton, and on the surface, he was a very affable, likable guy. But I didn't trust his politics, and I certainly wouldn't trust him around Miss Connie, because
Right.
he had a reputation there. So, but at any rate, enough about this. We'll get into all this next week. If you want to know where the real cover-up might have come from, Ray Blanton, we'll talk about that next week.
Okay.
Dennis, we'll have you back on. We'll cover it all.
Thank you, Mike.
So, in summary, was there a cover-up to protect Buford after Pauline's death? I believe so. Now, keep in mind that what you just heard was basically the opinions of Dennis Hathcock and myself. Of course, we've studied these people quite a bit. I don't think that we're wrong with what we said necessarily, but things could vary. I do believe that there was a great deal of political interference that changed the course of the investigation. And we have to keep that in mind. It's something that we strongly need to consider. And hopefully, District Attorney General Mark Davidson will have something to say on this as well. So who knows? Time will tell. Well, folks, just remember, as I always say, truth has no agenda. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you Saturday.